So what about Iraq? What's your position on Iraq and what's happening there?
Well, I think we want to get out. I mean, I think it was a mistake to go in. I mean, the casualties, almost 5,000 American and coalition dead. The estimate of the number of dead Iraqis starts at 100,000. The best estimates are probably 200,000, and some they go up to 1 million. It's an extraordinary casualty roll. Then you have to recognize the number of injured is even more than that. Probably 4 million Iraqis forced from their homes. The historic Christian community utterly devastated. Half of the Christians are out. Many of them in places like Syria, which we view as an almost axis of evil country, and Lebanon and other places. So I think that it strengthened Lebanon and it strengthened Iran. It created more hatred and kind of a cause of anger towards the United States and other places. So I think it was a huge mistake to go in. I think that who knows how it's going to develop. I mean, they went more than 200 days without a government. They've tried to cobble something together. The antagonisms between different groups remain strong. Violence, still a fairly violent society. A lot of people die. I hope that it works out. I'm afraid that that we're going to end up with probably an authoritarian regime. We're not going to end up with the kind of liberal democratic system we would love to have. But the main thing, I think, is we need to turn responsibility over to the Iraqis. We're done. I mean, to the extent they have an insurgency and whatever, they have the resources to take care of it. It needs to be their problem. American forces need to come home and be out of that. So that's one where I think we say, okay, fine, declare victory and leave. We can't afford to keep 50,000 troops there, and there's no good reason to do so.
And what about Afghanistan? How do you see that ending or wrapping up?
Well, the hope, the current hope, of course, is some kind of a negotiated settlement, I think, in conjunction with, an American presence that helps create a more effective domestic regime. So you have you send in the American forces and the Allied forces and NATO and others. You kind of clear the area out of Taliban. You drop in a kind of government in a box. You drop in the Afghan government forces. So they hope to strengthen that, and at the same time have negotiations with Taliban forces, where you try to split the radical Taliban and the folks who are more favorable to terrorists and Al Qaeda from the ones who are primarily indigenous folks who just don't like occupiers. And then maybe you come up with a coalition government. You come up with some accommodation that might see the Taliban with a more broader governing role. Nevertheless, it would promote at least some stability, reduce the conflict. That's what everybody, I think, hopes for. Not everybody, but that's probably the strongest hope of a lot of people. You can strengthen the government and have ongoing negotiations and get a result that, at least won't have terrorists running around. It will preserve at least some degree some of the progress in Afghanistan. The problem is there's no guarantee that's going to happen. We've been there 9 years. I mean, you go there today. I mean, I went there in May, and you go to Kabul. This is a city where every block is a fortress. I mean, there's not a single embassy or military base or hotel or financial institution that's not behind walls and barbed wire and barriers. Everything. You go through square after square, intersection after intersection. There are police, there are armored Humvees, there are pickup trucks with machine guns on top, there are police, military. I mean, this is a place, after 9 years, this is what the U.S. has achieved in the capital of the country. I mean, it gives you a sense of the failure to establish an effective government. So if that's the result after 9 years, I'm just skeptical that we're going to be able to do better in the next year or two. And I don't think the American people want, and I think for good reason, they're not willing to support an occupation for another 5 years or 10 years. This is something where there's simply nothing at stake. That the real issue for us is terrorism. Who rules Kabul doesn't matter much in terms of terrorism. Right now, Al Qaeda, to the extent it's active, it's in Pakistan. It's not in Afghanistan. So we need to focus on terrorism and what you have to do to deal with those terrorist groups. That's not kind of creating a liberal regime in Kabul.
So your specialty is civil liberties, and how do you balance the war on terror versus civil liberties?
Well, it's a hard one. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, so we don't want to give up our society in the name of protecting abstract principles. At the same time, the society that we're trying to protect is a free society, and those principles are very, very dear. So I think what you have to do is, to the extent you empower government, you empower it very carefully, in a limited fashion, and you demand accountability. So my problem on things like the Patriot Act is, you could argue, I mean, after the 9/11, the President and Congress, we have to do something. My problem was, they needed to sit and think about it. Instead, it was just ram it through, quick, quick, quick. Well, no. I mean, this is, you don't want to give up what's essential to your country and the character of your nation in just kind of an afterthought. And then what really worries me is that, you can certainly argue the president needed some of those powers, but almost all of them, the way it was constructed, there was no oversight, no accountability. And the thing which the founders, made, certain of in the creation of our nation was the idea of checks and balances. You always have to have somebody there looking over somebody's shoulder. And the problem is not any particular president, whether it's President Bush or President Obama. Do you create these powers, which in the case of the war on terrorism, the problem is, the battleground is America. And what president is ever going to say the war on terrorism is over? So if you say the president now has near dictatorial powers, during wartime, what you're saying is he can do anything he wants in the name of fighting terrorism forever. That, I think, is a scary concept. President Bush asserted that he had a right as a president to order the arrest of an American citizen in the United States and hold him incommunicado in a Navy brig. Well, I think that's utterly inconsistent with the Constitution. Now, if you want him to have the power to order the arrest, someone has to be there to oversee that. Somebody has to check and make sure it's right. Somebody has to check the fact. There has to be a balance there. So that's where I think that we've made the mistake. It's not that you have to take some tough steps. Everybody's concerned about airline security. I travel through this. And what I worry about there is we've got more security theater than real security. The question is, how do you thwart terrorists? Well, it's not clear to me the way you thwart terrorists is with these imaging machines that are, these things are very explicit. TSA officials have their own names for them.
Hot topic right now, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And the other is the pat-downs. And the pat-downs have changed, the last 2 or 3 weeks. And, it's not technically fondling, I suppose, but an aggressive TSA. I've gone through these. I have a knee implant. I go through these every time I go through the airport. These things are, for anybody going through them, a real problem in terms of privacy. And the question is, are we actually getting good results, or are we simply having theater to convince people we're doing something? Or are there better ways? And I think there probably are in terms of trying to have, security that, preserves more of our dignity and, is probably less costly and indeed more effective.
Well, some of the talk show pundits were talking about Israel and how they've been doing this for decades and how we should learn from them and how come we haven't learned from them. What's your thought on that?
Well, there's certainly something we can learn from them. I went to Israel back in August. In Tel Aviv, they rely an awful lot on human intelligence and behavioral. They look for people who look nervous. They look. Where have you been? They look at your passport. There are a whole bunch of things they do. They will pull people aside and are rigorous in terms of questioning. There are people who fly there and get turned around and get kicked back. So these things do happen. The challenge is, number one, the Israelis are under a unique threat situation and have been at this for a long time. So they have some unique assets in trying to kind of get a sense for who's a likely threat. The second thing is they have one big airport, Tel Aviv.
Right.
That's it, Ben Gurion. America has oodles of big airports and massive number of small airports. So even if you think you can do this in Washington Dulles and in Honolulu, what do you do in Grand Forks, North Dakota? What do you do in Omaha? What do you do in Orlando? Can you replicate this? What I do, so I think it's hard to take the Israeli system and just bring it here. But what you can do, I think, is learn from that in the sense that what you really want to do is focus on trying to keep the wrong people off airplanes as opposed to getting everybody, the 99.9% of whom would never think about doing anything and worrying about so much what they're carrying on the airplane. And there I think you can do things where you have trusted traveler programs, you can expand. There are things you can do where basically you have a short, security, check. You suddenly go into a category. For the most part, these people get random checks, and you're done with them. Then you have a general traveling public, and then you have a much smaller pool of people where you try to narrow it down in terms of who do you actually have to be much more rigorous in terms of checking. And that takes some effort, but my guess is that at the end of the day, most people would be a lot happier with that. And if you did it right, you could basically take most of the American traveling public out of the intrusive searches, just have random checks, which I think to help try to catch and make sure that no one could ever be certain you could try to carry something through. and more narrowly focus your efforts.
So why this sudden controversy? We have the new machines that show supposedly everything under your clothes, and then you also have, why is there suddenly these new pat-downs? Where did that come from? Is that just a new policy?
They claim that it's required for security. There's no explanation. The previous pat-down, they used a wand, which metal,
that, right.
and then they gave you partial pat-down, but it did not go, to your...
It's more like your legs.
Yes,
and stuff, right?
and they kind of patted your,
and your back.
abdomen and
Right.
whatever. And I mean, there were elements of it. They kind of do a backhand sweep down and stuff. But I mean, it was not nearly the same. They claim for whatever that they believe this. For example, I think it's the underwear bomber. That this would catch the underwear bomber. I don't know. Maybe it would.
Yeah.
But the problem is, a committed terrorist can find other ways to get around it.
Oh, sure.
That so the people that are most likely to catch are simply anyone who wants to get something on. Probably going to figure out how to get something on, especially in terms of employees. Employees don't go through all the intrusive. What they do is with employees is they do a system, in terms of who do you trust, security checks and what have you. They try to make it easier in terms of don't focus so much on what they're taking in, but focus on who the people are. But it's for whatever recent reason they changed the pat downs, and I think the point is you put the pat down with the imaging machine, you suddenly have these two different things, both of which are intrusive.
Right.
And next week, Thanksgiving week, is going to be when it really hits.
Right.
Because that's when all these people who don't travel very much suddenly find themselves, fondled and groped, and wondering what on earth is going on.
Right.
I'm going to these machines where I'm finding out, everything.
Right.
Then the protests could grow.
And the lawsuits could grow.
Yes, exactly.